In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 8, in which we discuss business cycles, where in our last video, we recapped the tools that we developed thus far in the course, as well as examined the real GDP series for the United States in order to define two main branches of macroeconomics in the form of economic growth, as well as business cycles. Where in regards to today's discussion, it will focus on business cycles, such that we will consider the properties of business cycles, as well as pose the question on if these business cycles are stable or not, which will lead us to introducing the two main schools of economic thought in terms of the stability of these cycles in the form of the classical and Keynesian schools of economic thought. So to begin, in our last video, we attributed business cycles as the cyclical portion of real GDP, where we defined business cycles as alternating periods of economic growth and contractions, where an alternative way of expressing that is short-run fluctuations in real output or real GDP, where here we have a graphical representation of the cyclical portion of real GDP for the United States or its business cycles, where on the horizontal axis we have time from 1960 until 2021, and on the vertical axis we have the percentage change from the preceding period in regards to real GDP, where this cyclical portion of real GDP is the noisy portion of the real GDP series, in that we removed the trend component of real GDP that's used to study economic growth, where the trend component corresponds to that constant growth rate value of 3% that the United States experiences. So with this cyclical portion of real GDP, we observe that there's periods in which it increases as well as decreases across time, and we observe that these periods of increases and decreases are not very predictable. Additionally, they seem to be fluctuating around a particular value, and as it turns out, this cyclical portion fluctuates around that constant growth rate value of 3% that coincides with that trend portion to real GDP. So then, to recap these observations, by definition, business cycles alternate between periods of growth and contraction, where it turns out business cycles fluctuate or oscillate about the constant growth rate value that corresponds to the trend component to real GDP, which for the United States is a value of 3%. So using this information, we can then define the business cycles for the United States by components. So to do so, let us consider both the trend and cyclical portion to the real GDP series, where we have that below in our graphical representation, where real GDP is going to be on the vertical axis and time is going to be on the horizontal axis. This upward sloping blue linear curve corresponds to that trend component to the real GDP series, where that constant growth rate of 3%, and this orange cyclical portion corresponds to the cyclical portion of the real GDP series, or the business cycles, where an immediate thing to observe, though, is unlike the business cycles and cyclical portion that we observed with actual US data, in our graphical representation that we have here, we see that it's very predictable and that our highs and lows are even, which is not the case, but it will be useful in terms of classifying these components. So in regards to these cycles, the first thing that we can do is that for a given cycle, we can define a max value as well as a min value, where the max value is going to correspond to a peak, and we see that there are 3 peaks in this corresponding illustration, and that these peaks are strictly above that growth trend value of 3%, and given that, we can say that these are going to be periods in which the economy is overperforming in regards to its current resources of technology and labor. And likewise, if we have a max value for a cycle, we're also going to have a minimum value, which we can define as a trough. And in this graphical illustration, we have 2 values of a trough. And if a peak corresponds to an economy that's overperforming given its current resources, then a trough is going to correspond to an economy that is currently underperforming given its current resources. Where if it's underperforming, that could imply producing on a point interior of the PPF, which means that unemployment is currently a problem. So now that we have defined a max and a min value, we can also define movements from a max to a min and movements from a min to a max value. So let us start with max to min, or a contraction in which this is going to be a period in which real GDP declines. Where in a graphical illustration, this corresponds to going from a peak value declining down to a trough value, where with this decline, this economy is currently overperforming given its current resources, and it begins contracting until it intersects our growth trend value of 3%, in which now this economy is producing at capacity, that is, it's efficiently using its resources, and then it continues declining until it reaches a trough, in which it's strictly below the growth trend value of 3%, and so this economy is underperforming. And given this illustration, now considering movements from a minimum to a max value, this is going to correspond to a recovery, or a period in which real GDP increases, where in this illustration, we're going from a trough value, this economy begins recovering, and then it begins effectively using its resources once again, which occurs when it intersects the growth trend value of 3%, in which it's efficiently using its resources. It begins recovering or expanding now at this point until it reaches a peak, in which now it's strictly above its growth trend value, and we say that this economy is now overperforming given its current resources and technology. So with this classification in place, this also allows us to get some foreshadowing in terms of the difference between a short-run and a long-run equilibrium in the aggregate product market for an economy, where recall that our definition for when the aggregate product market clears, or at least at potential, will be with alignment of our goal of full employment, that is the lowest rate of unemployment compatible with price stability, and this is going to correspond to when our aggregate product market has aggregate demand and aggregate supply compatible with one another such that the economy is efficiently using its resources, and this will correspond to a long-run equilibrium, whereas if we do not have that and aggregate demand and aggregate supply are compatible with one another, we will be at a short-run equilibrium, in which this would correspond to a peak in which the economy is overperforming, in which we'll have the typical case of inflation being the problem. So then this does not go alongside our goal of full employment in that we do not have price stability, whereas on the other hand, another possible short-run equilibrium is that we are at a trough in which we have an economy that's underperforming, where the common problem is going to be unemployment, where now we're violating our goal of full employment in regards to the lowest rate of unemployment possible. So then, with that in mind, in regards to these business cycles, an additional question that we might want to ask ourselves now that we have this classification in order and some foreshadowing in terms of differentiating between the short and long run in regards to equilibria, are these cycles stable over time or not? That is, do these periods of growth and decline converge to the growth rate value over time, or will they diverge? Well, the answer to this question will depend on what school of thought as well as what set of assumptions we use in regards to business cycles. Where in regards to schools of thought, there is the classical school of thought as well as the Keynesian school of thought. Beginning with your introduction of the classical school of economic thought, classical economics is the school of economic thought in which business cycles are thought to be stable and self-adjust over time, where this relies on the assumptions that wages and prices are flexible. That is, consumers have the ability to renegotiate with firms in regards to their wages. Likewise, firms have the ability to renegotiate with their suppliers in regards to their input resources in order to be able to alter their prices. This set of assumptions has merit when examining long-run implications of business cycles, that is, when the economy is producing at potential and there's a long enough time frame in which consumers can renegotiate their wages such that wages are variable in the market, and firms also can renegotiate with their suppliers on input resources in order to overall renegotiate prices on their goods and services. And this will allow us to examine the implications if there is a change in the economy. What is the overall effect in the long run in terms of producing at potential? This was the prominent school of thought prior to the Great Depression, where after the Great Depression, the assumptions of flexible wages and flexible prices came into question, in that, as mentioned, it has some merit when examining long-run implications on the business cycles, but it's not as practical for short-run analysis for the business cycles, given that in the short run, consumers can be locked into their contracts with firms in regards to their wages, and they may only have the opportunity to renegotiate every 1, 3, 5, or however many years it may be. And so given that period in which they're locked in, we say that they have sticky wages and that they're not readily available to adjust. Likewise, firms can be in contracts with their suppliers in regards to their input resources, such that there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of firms being able to adjust their prices. And so we say that prices on goods and services in this time period are also sticky. So given this scenario in the short run, if there is a negative shock to the economy and the economy begins underperforming or overheating, given these sticky wages and prices, it may very well not be the case that the economy adjusts back to a long-run equilibrium, but in fact, the economy begins performing even worse due to these sticky wages and sticky prices. And this is exactly what happened in the Great Depression, in that the economy did not self-adjust and actually got worse over time. So then this led to the Keynesian school of economic thought, where Keynesian economics is the school of economic thought in which business cycles are thought to not be stable over time, as it rejects the assumptions of flexible wages and prices for the short run. Since business cycles are not stable, and the economy will get worse over time given a negative shock to the economy, then the government must intervene in terms of restoring a long-run equilibrium, that is, the economy producing at potential, aligning with our goal of full employment. Where overall Keynesian economics, as mentioned, was a critique on classical economics due to its failure to explain the Great Depression. Where overall Keynesian economics has merit analyzing business cycles in the short run given sticky prices and sticky wages, where if the economy begins overheating or underperforming, the government must then step in to help in the form of fiscal policy, that is, use of government spending or taxes, or the Federal Reserve must step in terms of altering the money supply to alter the interest rates and overall adjust the aggregate product market back to an equilibrium that supports full employment. So then, with these two schools of thought introduced, as well as the classification of business cycles, where we'll pick up in our next video is introducing the ADAS model as a framework for the aggregate product market of an economy.